Hello everybody, and today we'll be discussing new institutional economics in under 11 minutes. Begin by defining new institutional economics, which we will now refer to as NIE. NIE is a subconcept of institutional theory which differentiates between formal and informal institutions. Under the NIE, there exist institutional actors, which exist and interact with one another within the confines of an institutional environment. The purpose of NIE is to holistically visualize and understand economic systems from the viewpoint of social actors, particularly focusing on how actors interact and the organization of institutions. However, NIE is only one small concept within the wider institutionalism discipline. Other perspectives, such as institutional logics and new institutionalism, investigate institutions using other differentiators, rather than formal and informal. So, let's move on to the greatest institutionalism. What is an institution? Broadly put, institutions are humanly created rules of the game that determine political, economic, and social interactions between institutional actors. Institutional actors being the people or organizations that exist within an institutional environment. These humanly devised institutions determine the economic behavior, transaction costs, and market outcomes for actors that operate in different societies. Within new institutional economics, there may be either formal or informal institutions, and we will now discuss these at length on the following slides, beginning with formal institutions. These are the official rules and procedures that are created, communicated, and enforced through channels socially accepted as official. Formal institutions span political, judicial, economic, and contractual realms. Essentially, any type of institution that we, as a society, regard as official. For example, national constitutions, intellectual property rights, laws, political systems, and so forth. However, for formal institutions to actually work and be effective, they require decent and effective enforcement mechanisms. For example, court systems and the police. Without these, formal institutions become useless. These enforcement mechanisms must also comply with informal institutions, otherwise their authority becomes useless. For example, the formal institutions imposed by the police and the court were overlooked during COVID and Black Lives Matter protests, as these diverged against informal institutions. Formal institutions must comply with informal institutional behavioural and cultural norms and expectations. The reason being that if institutional actors collectively disagree with a formal institution, they can force it to change. For example, if the British government tried to implement a change that British citizens collectively disagree with, then the British citizens may protest and cause the formal law to change. However, this doesn't normally happen, as formal institutions are beneficial in that they reduce the cost of transacting and the cost of uncertainty associated with everyday life. For instance, by ensuring that law and order are in place, and this in turn will reduce crime, or, for instance, by outlining the expected codes of conduct for businesses in order to prevent opportunism and poor competitive practice. Now, moving on to informal institutions. Informal institutions are, usually unwritten, socially shared rules that are created, communicated, and enforced by unofficial regulators through non-legal, non-economic, and non-political channels. Rather, these are enforced through interaction between social institutional actors. Informal institutions are developed through centuries of social organic interaction, as actors interact and form collective agreements concerning the most effective and acceptable methods of conducting transactions and communicating. However, sometimes informal institutions may be changed by formal institutions, such as when the Communist Party of China outlawed an indigenous, centuries-old Chinese tradition called foot binding, as it was seen backwards by the party. Informal institutions may be categorized broadly into two subsections, according to the new institutional economics proponent, William Scott. These being normative behavioural and cultural cognitive. Normative behavioural institutions are the social expectations and pressures that determine behavioural norms such as routines, standard procedures, codes of conduct, sanctions, and so on. Comparatively, cultural cognitive institutions compose the various elements of high culture, such as language, shared beliefs, and religion. Cognitive cultural elements are what we would typically call to mind when we imagine culture, as these are the most noticeable elements to outsiders. Now moving on to institutional distance, which is a very simple and very common concept within NIE. Simply, it refers to the amount of differences between the institutions of two regions, whereby the greater the institutional differences, the greater the institutional distance. Institutional distance does not always equate with geographical distance, such as Australia and Canada being very institutionally similar, but geographically distant. But most of the time, the two are related, such as, for instance, the Congo, Japan, and the UK being very institutionally and geographically distant, compared with two neighbouring towns within the UK, which would very likely be institutionally similar due to their geographical proximity. One example of formal institutional differences is political systems, as different societies have formulated different institutions to govern their socio-political behaviour. Comparatively, an informal institutional example could be greetings, as you can see on the screen now. As shown on the right, you can see that different countries demonstrate different styles of greetings, such as in the UK they do handshakes. In Japan, bowing is a common greeting, whereas in Saudi Arabia one can expect nose kisses. These are all determined by how actors found it most appropriate to conduct transactions, which in this case the transaction would be greetings. As you can see, dependent upon where the country is located, the actors there have formed their own way of conducting transactions and interactions. Prevalence of specific institutions is also associated with the levels of economic development within any given nation. This is also a very simple concept to grasp. The more developed a nation is, the more formal institutions there will be within that nation, whereas the less developed a nation is, the more informal institutions there will be within that nation. Think about the Congo jungle or the Amazonia. There are very few formal institutions governing the organisations and individuals within these jungles, whereas in a society such as New York or London, there appears to be a formal institution for almost every scenario imaginable. And there are two reasons for this. Firstly, more economically developed nations have increased specialisation of labour and more complex ways of operating, which in turn requires more complex and specific institutions that reflect this complexity, of which formal is the most appropriate. And second, economically underdeveloped nations lack the infrastructure, capital and knowledge to create and enforce formal institutions, especially amongst rural and indigenous communities, which may be hard to reach and enforce within. Since formal institutions are determined by informal institutions, the lack of formal institutions in underdeveloped nations is no issue, as informal institutions can play an adequately substitutive role. So, new institutional economics is a strand of institutional theory which seeks to holistically understand societal economical systems through investigating the interactions between institutional actors and the formation of formal and informal institutions. Formal institutions are those official rules and procedures that are created, communicated and enforced through channels regarded as official, typically spanning political, judicial, economic and contractual realms. Informal institutions are socially shared rules that are usually unwritten, that are also created, communicated and enforced by unofficial regulators through non-legal, non-economic and non-political channels. These may either be normative behavioural or cultural cognitive institutions. Institutions differ on a community level basis, with greater geographical distance equating to greater institutional distance. Hence, there may be clashes when actors from different institutional contexts interact, if you can recall the greeting example given on that slide. Formal institutions are, lastly, more prevalent amongst economically developed countries, whilst informal institutions are far more pervasive amongst less economically developed countries. And so that is everything for today. Go ahead and subscribe if you wish to learn more business school concepts, and I will see you for the next video where we will be discussing regional economic integration. Thank you.